Good morning, everyone. This is Tim Gleisner from the Library of Michigan, talking today to author Miles Harvey about his book, The King of Confidence. It's a book about King James Strange. Just to let you know that this is part of the 2021 Michigan Notable Books program. It's all virtual this year, obviously because of the COVID crisis. So thank you for being here. And Miles, thank you for being here with us today. How are you?
Tim, I'm great and honored to be part of this program.
Well,
So
we are
thanks.
very happy to have you here. And, just to let you know that your book was one of the first ones, one of the early contenders, if you will. It was definitely one that we put on the list right from the beginning. And I'm wondering if you could just, for our audience, just give us some background on yourself and how did you become a writer?
Well, I've been a writer. I've been getting paid to write since I was 15 years old when I started writing sports for the local paper outside of Chicago, the Downers Grove Reporter, now defunct,
Oh,
Tim.
nice.
But fans of that newspaper will remember my august byline as a 15-year-old sports reporter. But, I don't know quite what has drawn me to writing, except that it's the one thing I've ever been particularly good at since I was a kid, and I love it. And I guess I'll just say that a writer's life, or at least the writer's life I've had, just puts you in constant contact with other people. I've interviewed many hundreds, if not thousands, of people over the course of my career, and I've just had the opportunity to dive into lives past and present. And one of the most fascinating lives I've had the opportunity to just dig into was James J. Strang, who, as many residents of Michigan already know, was a guy who tried to create a quasi-independent kingdom on Beaver Island between 1850 and 1856. And it was just a joy to research this book. And I think I moved along the story of James Strang. I'll talk about that in a bit, but I think I helped add to the historical record with this book.
So you started in Downers Grove. Like, where did your career take you from there? I mean, you were 15, you were a sports reporter, and then eventually you're ending up writing histories on Strang. So,
Yeah, well, I quickly realized I'm still a huge sports fan, but I quickly realized that talking to athletes is not the most interesting of careers. And nothing against athletes, and I think athletes are a lot more interesting in my day, or in the current day, than they were in my day. But I eventually wound up at the University of Illinois, where I had the opportunity to work on a great college newspaper at that time, the Daily Illini, with amazing other writers. So for instance, Larry Doyle, who was a longtime writer and producer for The Simpsons and has won a big award for comedy writing in the United States, was one of my closest colleagues and in fact a mentor to me. Dave Cullen, the guy who wrote Columbine, the best-selling and much acclaimed book, was one of my colleagues and good friends, all these guys. There's a guy named Kevin Davis who has written a bunch of fascinating nonfiction books. Donna St. George, who works for the Washington Post. I could just name the list. I was so blessed then to work with these amazing other young writers, and it was just a heady atmosphere at the Daily Illini. And then much later, I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan, and not only had the chance to study under great writers like Nick Delbanco and Charles Baxter, but also lucked into another situation where I was working with Michael Paterniti, who's a really well-known nonfiction writer, book writer and magazine writer, and a great friend of mine. Bill Lychak, a wonderful fiction writer. Cammie McGovern, who's got an amazing book coming out. She's written many books, but she's got an amazing book coming out on kind of on autism in this country. And so I guess I was just sort of blessed, and so my writing career has put me in contact with all these other amazing writers, and that too has been a great blessing. And yeah.
fantastic. So why this book? Why King of Confidence? I mean, you obviously have written other books and you've had a long writing career, but what drew you to him, or how did you even discover him? Because I'll be honest, I'm from Wisconsin, and until I moved to Michigan, I had never heard of the man. I mean, I'm born and raised in Milwaukee, and yeah, just no idea about it.
Well, I guess I'd known vaguely about him. I think the first time I ever heard about him, and and I must say I didn't connect any of these dots. I have a brother-in-law, a guy named Chris Carr, who grew up in Burlington, Wisconsin, which is, as you know, Tim, this little
Right.
town
Yeah.
about 2 hours northwest of Chicago. Beautiful little town where two rivers meet, the White and the Fox. And
Sure.
um, Chris and I were driving around town one day, and he started pointing out these buildings to me and beautiful sort of, simple 19th century buildings, and started weaving this tale of this amazing prophet who had lived there, this Mormon prophet from the 19th century. And sort of, I couldn't believe it. And Chris was just telling me this story, and uh, I didn't, I filed it away as like fascinating trivia. Wish Downers Grove had been half that interesting. And then I have a writer friend named Donovan Hone who had told me about it as well. I think he reminded me of that later, and he, I think, was looking into doing a book on it and never did it. But this was such a lucky break, Tim. Writers. It's not a great time for writers right now.
Okay.
But a few years ago, I think my agent shot me an email or called me up and said, there's an editor from Little Brown, a big publishing house in New York, who wants to talk to you. And I was in a position to turn down that phone call, but I was pretty skeptical about it. The only other times sort of editors have come to me feeling me out about books, they've been books I would be terrible at, a ghostwriting for famous people or something like that. I didn't take them. I'm not sure I was even offered them, but I took myself off the possibility list really quickly because I wouldn't do the work. I wouldn't be interested in the work, and I'd be bad at the work. So I was skeptical about this going in, but this guy, Ben George, who had read my earlier books and knew that I sort of was interested in characters like Stang. My previous book had been about a guy who went around the country stealing old maps out of libraries, and he was
I
really a
do
con
remember
man
that book.
himself,
Yes, I
a
remember that
modern
book.
day con man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
This guy named Gilbert Bland. And so this editor, Ben George, said, hey, I can't promise you anything, but I'd love you to write a book proposal for me about Stang. And I was just taken from the start. And I realized really early on, Tim, there have been at least 3 good books written about Stang before, and I was lucky to build on those authors, and I'm glad to talk about them here. They all did important research in their own way, but I think the thing about Strang's story that struck me from the start is, it's always been treated as kind of a footnote to Michigan or the Midwest, history of the Midwest. One really good book about Stang is called Assassination of a Michigan King on University of Michigan Press.
Sure.
And I get that, or a footnote to Mormon history, and I just saw Stang as this great American story. I saw him from the start as this lightning rod for all the crazy enthusiasms and social movements and religious excesses and great societal change of the 19th century. And so I think that really distinguishes King of Confidence in a certain way. As I saw it as a fundamentally American story about the years leading up to the Civil War.
So just
And so that's how I got started on it, and it went from there. And this relationship with this editor, Ben George, was just it was a great relationship, and I was blessed not only that he called me, but he's also a wonderful editor.
so did he know about Stang and he came to you and
Yeah,
found out
he
about
had.
you?
I think I may be getting this wrong, but I don't think I am. He had Ben has had quite an interesting career, a very literary career, and he had been the editor of quite a good literary magazine, and I think this I'm getting this right because he had published a story about a fictional story about Stang, and he'd just been fascinated by the case ever since he'd read about that and had to do some fact checking and research just on that fictional story.
Sure.
And had always been in the back of his mind, boy, I'd love to edit a book about this. And so at some point he must have just said, okay, I'm going to fish around for writers. And I was lucky to be the one he chose.
So give us some background on Stang. I mean, like before I read your book, I mean, I knew about him here in Michigan, had no clue. I would have guessed he had something to do with Nauvoo and all that, but had no clue that he had any sort of Wisconsin connection. I mean, who was Stang? What was he about?
Well, interestingly, he had almost no connection. I don't think there's evidence that he ever went to Nauvoo. In fact, I think he was afraid to go to Nauvoo, but I'm jumping ahead of the story.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
So Stang grew up in Western New York, in a big region called the Burned Over District. And the reason it was called the Burned Over District is because so many fires blew through there, religious fervor. This is, when we think of religious camp meetings and whatnot, this is the place. It's just an intense place of religion, but also of social movements, right? So the Erie Canal gets built, and it's sort of this psychic vector, and it brings all this social change to Western New York and all these exciting things. So amazing things like the women's movement starts in Western New York, and abolitionism is very hot in Western New York. And then also just like mainstream Protestantism, but to an intense degree, but also just crazy stuff, these sort of self-declared prophets running around, and spiritualism starts there, but also these really interesting alternative religions, most notably Mormonism, which starts in Western New York and during Stang's lifetime. The interesting thing about him, Tim, is that we got his diaries from the time he was about 19 to early 20s. He was an atheist, and he grew up in a very religious Baptist family, and he had to keep that a secret. So he wrote it in code, which is one of the wonderful things. So he had to present two faces from the start. And so I think one of the things that makes him such an interesting person is that there's both this idealist and then there's this manipulator. And he writes in his diaries, I'm an atheist, but man, I know the Bible. And when I talk about religion, woo-hoo, people really, perk up. And so he knew he had the potential, I think, from the start to really manipulate people. And he was really interested in manipulators. One of his early heroes was Napoleon. Anyway, he attempted to be a self-taught lawyer in Western New York. And I think he was a pretty good lawyer in some ways, but he was a con man, and he would rip people off and they didn't like it. And so eventually that dried up. He was a postmaster, which was a really important job in the 19th century, a political job, but there was a shift in the presidential administration and that dried up. And then he attempted to run a newspaper. He was, interestingly to me, a very good writer of a certain kind. He wasn't Mark Twain or Herman Melville, but he could sling a sentence, as we say, and he was a good propagandist, and he always had newspapers. And so all these failures, and he eventually had to leave Western New York in the middle of the night, literally a fly-by-night thing, because he sold a guy some land that didn't exist. It's reported that he faked his own death, which was, not unusual in those times. And he wound up in this little town in Wisconsin, Burlington, where he had friends, and some of those friends were Mormons. This was a really cutting-edge, exciting religion for a lot of people. It's not clear I should say he never went to Nauvoo. He did go to Nauvoo. He may have never gone back. He wound up in Nauvoo shortly before Joseph Smith, the founder and prophet of the Mormon Church, was murdered. And he converted to Mormonism, Tim. And I can't tell you whether that was real. He had a really keen intellect, and he was intellectually curious. Whether this just excited him, this new religion that was kind of sweeping the country, or whether he just saw it, as some of his colleagues at the time later said, as an opportunity to rip people off. But in any case, he became a Mormon. And then when Smith died a few months later. Stang produced a letter purportedly from Smith,
Yeah.
declaring him the head of
Yeah.
the Mormon Church, which would be, Tim, like sort of, I have been to the Library of Michigan. It would be like me suddenly being appointed the head of the
Right.
Library of
I
Michigan.
mean, I think that's the thing that came across to me, just the audacity. I mean, he was a relative newcomer to the whole thing, and suddenly he's saying, I'm catapulted to the top. I mean, it just,
Well, you know, this is a time when I think there are times in our history, and I think we're going through one now, when the truth is porous, right? There'd been all this incredible social, demographic, economic, technological change. This is the period when the telegraph comes in.
right.
So all of a sudden you can simultaneously have information passing hundreds of miles at a time. I mean, mind blowing. The photograph comes in, so you can stop time. The trains come in, so all of a sudden the country becomes a much smaller, more integrated place. This is screwing with people's very relationships with space and time. But also, you know, this is the time leading up to the Civil War, and already there are those great fissures in our country. But it's also a time when we're suddenly a mobile society, right, in the United States, and so it's a society of strangers.
Mhm.
And so you have to, so confidence, literally the confidence becomes this currency. You have to have confidence. Tim, I don't know you, but I have to figure out whether the banknote you give me, Tim, is reliable, because there was no central currency, right? So
Yeah,
you're giving me a note from a bank in Cincinnati to pay me, and I don't know if that bank actually exists,
sure.
and I don't know. So I have to figure out, like, can I trust this guy? And if you exude a certain confidence, I'm gonna trust you. And so this is the period where we get the word confidence, man. We know exactly when it starts in 1849 in New York in a newspaper, and it spreads like wildfire throughout the country because there are so many of these people running around who are exploiting people's confidence.
I've
And-
never thought of the country at this time. That I really love how you just described it. They were communities of strangers. I mean, it never even occurred to me. And I've studied history. I'm not a historian, but I it never occurred to me. And you're right. It just never dawned on me. I mean, that's really apt. I apologize. It made me stop, and it's just an amazing revelation for myself.
Yeah, and as a result, the truth becomes really, I used the word porous before, but also just
Right,
bendable. This is the period of P.T. Barnum, right? The
right.
exact period of P.T. Barnum. And Strang had a lot of Barnum's showmanship, but also he was a great manipulator. Barnum, we think of him, I think, sometimes as a circus guy now, but he was basically a professional hoaxer, right? He
Sure.
had this museum in New York called the American Museum, and
Mhm.
I talk about in the book where he brings this mermaid into display, and
Right.
this supposedly dead mermaid. And Barnum says, people would come to the American Museum by the thousands to see the mermaid, and a lot of people left saying, no, that's not a mermaid, that's a fish sewn to a monkey. And Barnum's response was, yeah, maybe so, but if you think that's true, why don't you bring your grandmother and your cousins in tomorrow and pay admission, and we can talk about it more then, right? And I think Strang played on that. Like the letter I described didn't really win over a lot of Mormons. We think it's a forgery now, but it's
Right.
a very good forgery, partly because he knew so much about how the mail worked,
Mhm.
because he was a postmaster. But he then, in Burlington, Wisconsin, your home state, Tim, dug
Yeah.
up some brass plates. He had his followers or co-conspirators, depending on how you look at it, dig up some brass plates out of a hill in Burlington. And Tim, you're going to be shocked. This is a giveaway in the book. There was only one person in the world who could translate the never before seen kind of runes on those brass plates, and he also happened to live in Burlington, Wisconsin. And his name happened to be James J. Strang. And Tim, you're going to be shocked at this one too. Those plates pretty much established Strang as the leader of the Mormon Church too. And, you know, it might sound goofy to us now, but he really got hundreds of followers, including, you know, one of Joseph Smith's brothers and some family members, but also some true believer leaders of the church who really saw him as a potential prophet. Most of those people pretty quickly soured on him. But he had that confidence. He exuded this sense of confidence, and he brought people in. And at a time where, you know, people were, as you say, you know, just like really desperate for some sense of meaning and order in their lives, he offered, you know, these really kind of enticing solutions to really difficult and scary problems.
So, okay, so he's in Burlington, Wisconsin, but then the reason why he's famous in Michigan, I mean, he takes the leap across the lake, if you will, to Beaver Island, right? I mean, how? Why? What was the impetus for that?
Well, I think Burlington was a tricky place for him. It's, you know, it's a great little spot. I love the town of Burlington. It's sort of the, but you know, I think the trouble there was Stang's followers could leave and his detractors could stay. You know, so there were some leaders of the church. So, I mean, he benefited from the fact that Nauvoo was falling apart then. Anti-Mormon riots were going on, and eventually Brigham Young had to take the church west. And that was truly scary for people from Nauvoo. Nauvoo was then probably the biggest city, if not, probably bigger than Chicago.
Really? It was that
But
big?
yeah, it's huge, and it
Wow.
was a international cosmopolitan city. All these people who'd been recruited from England. It was on the Mississippi,
Right.
but partly because Nauvoo allowed the kind of thing that Stang later was accused of, sort of a lot of outlaws to operate there. They had a quasi-independent status. They'd convinced Abraham Lincoln and a bunch of other Illinois legislators to give them a quasi-independent status, and they
Sure.
became sort of you know, a refuge for scoundrels, Mormon and non-Mormon. But in any case, you know, that those people were forced to go west, and a lot of them were scared. I mean, literally, the maps of the region that's, you know, now Salt Lake City were wrong. So they were literally going into unmapped wilderness,
Sure.
and what Brigham Young is moving, you know, thousands and thousands of people west is absolutely a stunning and important part of American history. But Stang benefited from that in that a lot of people were like scared off by that. And then also Stang benefited for a short time because he announced himself as being completely against polygamy, which was then a not very well kept secret in Nauvoo, and
Sure.
that upset a lot of people in Nauvoo. And so people followed him up to Burlington, but then a lot of them soured on him. And I think it was just too porous. And he realized that he needed a place where his detractors couldn't get to, and potential enemies. I mean, strategically, islands are easier to defend
Sure.
than towns. When, I mean, he saw what happened in Nauvoo when,
Mhm.
people were burned out of there, and with the help of government. Um, uh, and then it was much harder for his followers to stay. As a lot of Michiganders will know, Beaver Island is pretty much frozen in by ice for a big chunk of the year. It's like
Right.
literally, like, for his followers, it was kind of I don't want to say a prison, but it's, we didn't have a word for it then, but this is when cults are starting. And
Mm.
one thing we know now with modern cult research is that cult leaders isolate their followers, right? And so he was able to do that. The other thing, and this is somewhere I think the King of Confidence has moved the historical record along, is that Beaver Island was a great place to set up a pirate colony. So
Definitely. So he's on Beaver Island. He gets up there. I mean, describe what he was trying to set up. I mean, yes, pirate community, but definitely like a strong measure of autonomy. I think you said that earlier.
yeah,
Right? I
yeah.
mean,
I mean, with always things, with always things with Stang, Tim. There's the, I mean, it's one of the things that made him so fascinating to write about. There's the idealistic side and the cynical side. And on the idealistic side, I think we can call Beaver Island a utopian experiment, one of many going on in the United States at that time. And where people are trying to build a better world. Not only that, the people of Beaver Island, the true believers, think that they're ushering in their lifetimes, the second coming of Christ on Beaver Island. So people had a real motivation. The cynical side is that Stang set up this outlaw colony where he would literally send ships out to raid towns, including Chicago, on the Lake Michigan shore, and would also send out horse thieves all over the Midwest to steal horses, which were then just a really super valuable commodity.
Sure, of course.
I think one of the things the King of Confidence has helped with the historical record, and there's at least one book that argues, oh, you know, all these contemporary reports about Beaver Island people raiding towns on the Michigan shore, that's all anti-Mormon hatred. He was a victim. You know, this was just a campaign, a smear campaign against him. Well, I'm sure, I mean, anti-Mormon hatred was real and terrible and violent, and I'm not diminishing it at all. But the research I did, I think I have more than any other writer before me, has really pinned down actual crimes committed, actual jail time served by his people. And so I think there's absolutely no doubt that he was running a pirate colony. Did some of the people believe they were doing God's work? Sure they did, just as some of the people in various religions who commit crimes. I mean, we think of, you know, a Muslim extremists think they're doing God's work. I think some of his true believers thought they were, you know, just getting the resources. Look, if you think you're bringing Jesus Christ's second coming around in your lifetime, you do not have time to worry about little itty bitty law, you know, state laws of Michigan. Oh, you know, that's a theft. Do you understand that? I think for a lot of people, but he also, one of the really interesting things about researching Stang is he also surrounded himself with some of the great and strange and charismatic con men of the 19th century who passed through his island at various times and worked with him and at various times and against him at various times. So that was a blast to research too, because some of these guys are just so bigger than life.
I have a couple questions. So do you think Stang actually went up there with the intent of running a pirate community? Do you think that was in his, I mean, from just your research and what you've read, I mean, do you think, or it just evolved over time? I mean,
you know, so I think about Stang that, like, I think he was capable of a double consciousness, and I don't have any evidence of this. He left behind a ton of writing, through his newspapers, through letters, which all survive, or not all survive, but, you know, hundreds of them survive, and through these early diary entries. But I think Stang, and I think we've seen this with charismatic figures in our own time, demagogues, I think he was capable of thinking, yeah, I'm sending out horse thieves. I mean, he knew who he was sending out, and what they were doing. But, you know, I'm special. And so I get to do this, you know, that my crimes are, and I think he was proud. I mean, again, I don't want to, partly I don't want to psychoanalyze him because I don't want to reduce him to a type.
No, of course.
He was wonderfully complex. But I think, you know, he was a narcissist, right? And I think he thought he was better than other people. And I don't think he thought what he was doing in the way that narcissists don't was wrong, because I think he thought he was exceptional, right? And in many ways, not that it justifies any crimes he committed and the many crimes he committed, but he was an exceptional person. And Tim, you know, the other side of him, and again, I think my book moved this along, is he had this idealistic side. He twice got elected to the Michigan legislature and was served in Lansing. It's crazy. Did he get in by fraud? Yes, he got in by fraud and clever ballot manipulation. But once he got there, even his worst enemies said, this guy is smart, he's well
Right.
read, he knows
Yeah.
how to make an argument. But the other thing was, he had, in one case, a real moral center. He was his whole adult life against abolitionism. And I think I say in the book that I think it's one of it's one of the real things he believed in, like maybe the only real thing he believed in, is the rights of African American people. And he fought hard for it in the Michigan legislature. And one time he got up and talked for 2 hours about the rights of African American people. And we know this is driven by idealism mostly. There was some cynicism to it too. I can talk about that. Because it was one thing Stang did that was against his best interests, right? He was a Democrat. But he, I mean, one of the exciting things about this book is that he served in the legislature right at his second term, was right when Republicans, the start of the Republican Party, famously in Michigan, take over the Michigan State House. And he not only votes with them, but is on the forefront of fighting for legislation that will help African Americans. For instance, Stang was one of the main proponents of what's called a personal liberty law, which undercut the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Basically, the Fugitive Slave Act said, slave catchers and slave owners can come up into the North and take their escaped slaves back. Well, this law said, yeah, we can't fight the federal law in that way, but you can't use our jails. We're not going to give you any support. So if you want to come up to Michigan and, catch your escaped slave in northern Michigan, and you want to walk for 72 hours with that slave until you get out of our state, you go ahead, but don't try to sleep here, and definitely don't count on our jails for assistance. That was something Stang fought hard for. And so, and I think I take the book back and find out where that passion, I think I take the story back and find out where that passion comes from in a way that other writers haven't. I think it's as much as I've built off the work of other writers, I also, I was proud to advance the story in that way.
And I got to
ask, he was just a contradictory guy.
Well, and I got to ask about the research, because you do pull in strands from that time that show the mood in the country, all the different enthusiasms, if you will, and things like that. And I want to ask about the research, because here you are in Chicago, and obviously Chicago has wonderful research institutions, but a lot of Stang is up here in Michigan. And I guess my question is, like, where did you go? How did you find all this information? Being an archivist and a librarian, I wonder this, because I'm always fascinated by that. But like, where did you go? How did you have to follow down leads on this man?
So yeah, I benefited in many ways. Like a lot of people in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Stang's followers were meticulous record keepers. And after he died, they saved those records, and one of the early writers about Stang compiled them all. There's a huge repository at Yale, in the Beinecke Library of Stang's work, huge and wonderful.
Sure.
Your own institutions have some good stuff. There's a great repository at Central Michigan University.
Yes.
So I benefited from all of those and more. I also was lucky to live at a time where 19th century newspapers have been digitized to a stunning degree, and it's just growing. And so I literally, sitting around this basement, which you see behind you, in my underwear, I literally made some discoveries that other people couldn't have made, because, if something doesn't appear in the paper you think it's going to appear in, then you're not going to make a trip to New Orleans to research Stang. Sure. And yet, through newspaper databases, you can find stuff about Stang in the New Orleans Times-Picayune, right?
Yeah.
So there's, and as you know, as an archivist and librarian, and you guys are my heroes, and we can talk about that. But I just think online stuff there's also, Hathi Trust and archive.org, which have all these books that are in public domain now, archived. And I really benefited from that. Again, doing, I'm really good with online research and archival research. I mean, I think it's something I love, and it's something you learn from doing a lot of it, and I've done a lot of it. But so I'm not undercutting my own work, hard work. Part of it is I just am willing to sit there for 3 hours to track down one thing that doesn't turn out to be anything. But I also think, you know, for researchers right now, man, the 19th century is an exciting time to research, because there's so much that is available to you that just wasn't available before. But and again, there's these, you know, for Stang, there's these great, including the Library of Michigan and the Michigan Archive, that are just great sources.
So I have a personal interest question, because you mentioned Yale at the Beinecke, you mentioned all the places in Michigan they researched, and newspapers online and stuff like that. The one place you didn't mention, I just wondering about his relationship. You didn't mention anywhere out in Salt Lake City, you know, with the repositories out there. Was there anything? I mean, because obviously there were competing different versions of Mormonism, I believe, that were going on here. So
yeah, well, he was kicked out of the church almost immediately. So he, you know, I mean, I don't, you know, I don't. So yeah, I did benefit, in fact, from I did not travel to Salt Lake, but I did get some. They were kind enough to send me documents, and some of the documents that the church has put out are already online, so I benefited from that. But they actually, I got to say, the archivists there were incredibly helpful. I wasn't sure what they would think about Stang, this apostate, you know, guy, but. And I got to say, like, you know, I'm not an expert on the Mormon Church, and I just don't know. But they were really kind to me, and they do have some stuff, and there are other religious-based groups that have some stuff too from some of the spin-offs of Stang. So I benefited from all of that, and of course I was able to build on these previous researchers who did wonderful work. But the story's just, you know, it's just so rich, and he's such a wonderfully three-dimensional figure, endlessly complicated and baffling, you know, definitely a man capable of good and also evil.
So how did you bring in all those strands from the 19th century, though? But I mean, that's the beauty of your book, King of Confidence. So I mean, what brought it in? Because I mean, that's what's wonderful about your book. It's not just about Stang, but it's about the overall society. I mean, like, how did you know? Like, what brought you to, like, yep, that's got to come in here now?
Yeah, I mean,
or whatever.
I mean, I think maybe that's what interests me in general. But I think that's what interested me about Stang from the start. As I said, you know, other people have written wonderfully about Stang, but it's been sort of, and this is not a criticism of some of the books I'm talking about. For instance, there's a book by Vicky Cleverly Speak that sort of tells the story through the women around Stang. That's a fairly recent book. That's wonderful. It's great, but I was able to, I guess I just saw Stang differently than other people. I didn't see him as like this little Michigan or Midwest footnote. And maybe it's because I see the Midwest differently. I mean, I see our region as central to America's story. I don't have a big chip on my shoulder. Oh, the coasts always ignore us. Right. I kind of hate, as a Chicagoan, I kind of hate people who are always whining about New York, unless it's the Mets and Yankees, and then we get to whine. But you know, but I do think the Midwest is so central to America's story in a way that is sometimes overlooked, even by professional historians. And so I saw it as that. But I guess I just, and you know, maybe Tim, there may be a little bit here too, where the fact that I'm not a professional historian, you know, I was trained as a journalist, and I now practice, I write fiction. I went to University of Michigan in the great MFA program there and wrote fiction, but I learned sort of fictional storytelling techniques that I now use in nonfiction. But I've sort of developed a unintended but much loved, for me, niche in sort of narrative history, which I think I'd benefit from the fact that, I knew something about the antebellum period before I started this book, but I had to learn so much. So one of the things I do when I start a book like this is I just read about the period for, weeks at a time. And so I think for, professional historians, some of that's like, yeah, that happened. We know about that. And it's also the way professional, academic history works. You zero in, and there's a good reason for it. You zero in on a very specific topic from a very specific angle based on countering or adding to very specific research someone did before you.
Sure.
And theses that someone used before you. Whereas I, as a generalist, I think I have the not only opportunity, but I also think I think I'm naturally sort of inclined to see where these things connect. Like one of the things I did with this book was I just put together a timeline that was, I don't know what it wound up, 250 plus single space pages, where I'm just putting down dates. And all of a sudden, I call it the narrative machine. All of a sudden, you see stuff emerging, right? Like, so stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so you see Stang, I'll give you an example. So Stang, as I said, was an abolitionist. I found in his newspaper that he put out on Beaver Island, which was then sort of broadcast out all over the country, this piece by Frederick Douglass, the great African-American former slave abolitionist. And it was an excerpt from a memoir that Douglass had just written. I can find no evidence that any other newspaper published this excerpt, so I think it's Stang's doing. And so there's this very idealistic side to it. Wow, and it's under the byline Fred Douglass, which just cracks me up. Like, hey, Fred, good to see you.
Right.
Anyway, and it seems like this honorable thing that Stang's doing and commendable thing that Stang's doing. And then you look at what the excerpt Stang chose and the time it's done. And this comes at a time when he's really being accused of theft, right? And the law is sort of moving in on him.
Sure.
And this book this excerpt is all about when it's okay for a slave to steal from his master. It's all about like, yeah, theft is bad, but in certain times, in certain moral circumstances, it's a necessity. And so to Stang's followers, that must have just read like, you're doing the right thing, check it out. And so, if you don't put the things in a timeline and see what's going on around this, first of all, I think why, you'd say, why is Stang publishing Frederick Douglass? But also, why is Stang publishing this story by Frederick Douglass now? And that is something that, I don't know, particularly interests me. And I also just, like I said, from the start, I just saw this guy as this lightning rod for this craziness. And by craziness, I don't mean wacky. There is tons of wacky stuff.
Sure.
But just all the powerful, powerful movements shooting through the culture at this time.
So let me ask, like, what ultimately happens to Stang? I mean, if you could just allude, and then just the community itself, because I have a follow-up question to that about, honestly, rumors that about the Stang community still to this day in the research community here in Michigan. So I want to.
Yeah, well, I may not. I think I'm going to turn around and become questioner when we get to that.
Yeah, because I've just heard things, and I want to just understand.
Well, I have a feeling you're ahead of me on that. But so, well, Stang's story is really interesting. We may laugh at this idea of a quasi-independent kingdom on U.S. soil, but Millard Fillmore, the president of the United States, did not laugh and sent in the Navy's, in 1851, the Navy's first iron-hulled warship to invade Beaver Island and bring Stang to justice. Right. In the end, there was no shooting on the beach. Stang surrendered. But the interesting thing was, Stang was put on trial in federal court in Detroit, and he won. And so in 1853, Millard Fillmore left office, kind of as going down as one of the most indistinguished, not good, not particularly talented American presidents of all time. And so the king outlasted the president who went out to destroy him. But eventually, Strang's own followers turned on him, and that's totally fascinating too, Tim. Kind of ostensibly, it was about the issue of pantaloons, women wearing pantaloons, these sort of pajama pants on the island. Strang ordered all the women on the island to wear these, and some people resisted fiercely. I think it was bigger than that. I think we could think about now about how masks have become politicized. Sure. No matter which side of the equation you're on, they represent something else. And I think this was the case with Strang, and it's very complicated. But eventually, with the help of the state of Michigan, probably, and the U.S. government, several of Strang's followers assassinated him in 1856. And for a few weeks, he was paralyzed below the waist. But he was taken back to Burlington, where he still had land, and he died there in 1856. And the story of his assassination made, big headlines all over the world, front page in the New York Times. This guy was, by then a real force in the United States, or some mix of sideshow and menace.
Sure. Well, and my follow-up is that, just the rumors I've heard that there are still followers of King James Strang, and that his writings are considered holy text, and that some institutions have to really kind of keep them. I mean, they keep them under lock and key as it is, but they take extra precautions because people might want to. And I've just heard that.
Well, there definitely are Strangites, and I've met at least one of them and been in communication with others. Some of them. So I at the beginning of this interview, I talked about my first trip to Burlington, Wisconsin. Yeah. There are several of them there, and in fact, in
Burlington.
Yeah, and my friend, and that's where I met one of them, a fairly prominent one, and my friend and brother-in-law, who grew up there, said he grew up around people from the church all the time, and so but there are I think there are only a few hundred of them left, and you can, if your listeners are interested, the Strangites keep a website that's and as far as library crime, I will leave that to you to talk about the rumors. I mean, I've
just heard rumors that letters might just disappear.
Yeah, well, as you probably know, Tim, my first book was about library theft.
Yep.
So I'm never surprised by anything and all the weird motivations for it. So whether the most sort of cynical, I can sell this to, yes. These guys who steal from people like you because they truly convince themselves that you don't love it enough.
Yes.
The stuff like
I've actually had people like that in past experiences.
I mean it's and as you know, we don't without getting into it, our culture doesn't put enough resources into protecting what is our great historical legacy. The work that you folks do is absolutely vital to the American enterprise, and I always tell my students, I teach at DePaul University, and I always tell my students, try to get the love of librarians because it will pay off. In The King of Confidence, there's this long section where I tried to thank any librarian I'd been in contact with.
Yes.
They were so vital, including people on your staff. They were so vital to my work on this book, and I'm just so grateful to them. One of the things I think that young people and young researchers don't value enough in the digital age is the extraordinary wisdom, resourcefulness, and power of a good research librarian who has this amazing database inside their head and has spent their whole life connecting dots. And sometimes you plug in and you bring a couple extra dots and miracles happen. It's really exciting.
Well, that's fantastic. That's a great summation. Thank you so much. And on behalf of all research librarians. Thank you. And thank you for your wonderful book. We've been speaking here today with Mr. Miles Harvey, the author of King of Confidence, book about King James Strang of Beaver Island. It was a 2021 Michigan Notable Book Award winner. And Miles, thank you so much today for being here with us. And we look forward to future works that come out from you anytime. Thank you.
Tim, thank you so much. And I'm just so honored to have the King of Confidence receive this great recognition. Thanks.
And we are so happy to have given it to you. Thank you very much. And thank you all for watching today, and look forward to more videos coming up shortly. Thank you. Have a good day.